Hello, I'm Mona Fluitt of Fluitt Nonprofit Solutions and TexasNonprofitTraining.com. I'm pleased to offer this recorded program for Power Tools for Nonprofits 2020. Today, I'll be discussing how QuickBooks thinks. This isn't meant to be a training program on how to use the QuickBooks software. That simply wouldn't be possible in the time allowed. But in my years of using and teaching QuickBooks for nonprofit use, I have discovered that many organizations aren't getting their money's worth out of this useful software program due to a lack of understanding of how the various QuickBooks functions are designed to work together to make accounting easier for the non-accounting professional. One very important note about QuickBooks Desktop versus QuickBooks Online. QuickBooks Online is a subscription-based system. There isn't any way to log onto an empty template of a company file to include any screenshots. Any QuickBooks screenshots you see in this presentation are from the desktop version. If you are a QuickBooks Online user, you may be quite shocked as to how different the QuickBooks Desktop user interface appears. However, today I'm discussing QuickBooks concepts, and those concepts apply to both desktop and online versions of QuickBooks. I'm sure we have a wide range of accounting skill sets with us today. On one end of the spectrum, maybe you have an accounting degree, or maybe you're a full-blown CPA. If not, maybe you took a basic accounting or bookkeeping course in high school or college. Or, on the far end of the spectrum, maybe you're one of those people who go to the grocery store each week and hopes that little machine doesn't explode when you swipe your card. So, wherever you fall on this scale of accounting skills, I'm guessing you're here because you've been handed the duty of managing your organization's accounting. And more specifically, you're using or considering QuickBooks for your accounting software. For many of us, this is the first database we ever used. In my last two classes at the United Way prior to the pandemic, I actually had people too young to know what this is. In case you don't recognize it, it's a library card catalog, and it is a database. This is also a database. These are databases. And in today's world, these are databases. My point is that QuickBooks is nothing more than a database. Now we think of QuickBooks as accounting software, but at its core, it is a database. It's just that the software programmers wrote it for the purpose of tracking accounting transactions using accounting-specific graphics and user interface. But QuickBooks is a database. And so I want you to recognize it as a database, design and build it based on the logic of a database, and use it like a database. More specifically, QuickBooks is a relational database. Well, what is a relational database? Even the simplest Excel spreadsheet is a database. But it's only two-dimensional, isn't it? We have columns running up and down and rows running across. I'm sure somewhere in your computer you have Excel databases. Either a mailing list you're tracking, or perhaps a list of gala tables, whether they are paid or unpaid, or tracking seat assignments. We all have Excel files serving as small, simple databases. For example, I can make a simple two-dimensional database of groceries in my kitchen. I can track these things by name. I can track them by type, whether they are fruits or vegetables. And yes, tomatoes are fruit. I could track them by color. I could track them by use. Some of these things I typically use in a salad, others I eat as a snack. Then in this two-dimensional database, I can sort on each of these fields. I can segment my groceries by color. I can separate them by fruits versus vegetables. Perhaps I want to sort by salad items versus snacks, which is almost the same grouping but moves my tomato from one group to another. But the magic of a three-dimensional relational database is seen when we want to go a little deeper with our queries and filters for reports or analysis. Maybe I want to create a query or filter that says, show me everything that is the color red and is used in a salad. So I filter out my apple. Or show me everything that is red but is a fruit. Well, now my apple is back in, but the onion is out. By having a relational database, my groceries are tracked by how they relate to each other in a variety of ways. In this example, the different labels I use to define those relationships include name, type, color, and use, which are our data points. But let's get out of my kitchen and back to accounting. So back to the idea of understanding how QuickBooks thinks. To do our accounting, we have inputs, including our transactions, our donors and vendors, our contributions, expenses, and even if our transactions are related to a specific program or a restricted grant that we need to track. In other words, our data points. We let our QuickBooks database do its thing to produce output that we present as financial statements to the board and grantors, conduct our business analysis or plan future budgets, or track a donor's giving history. Now, historical tracking is important, but I do believe that my example of tracking donor history is ideally the job of the development office and the constituent or donor database, such as Razor's Edge, Donor Perfect, eTapestry. There's a variety of products on the market. But the reality is that too many of my clients and class participants are from organizations that either can't afford or simply don't have the staffing to maintain multiple systems and end up relying on QuickBooks to be both their accounting and their donor software. Certainly not my choice. The finance and development departments are tracking different data points for different purposes, and QuickBooks simply doesn't have the functionality that a fundraising or constituent-specific database has for those purposes. However, if your options are limited, it is possible to fake it using QuickBooks as a simple donor database. So, understanding how QuickBooks thinks. Our QuickBooks database requires 6 data points for each transaction. They're simple enough to remember because they are simply who, what, when, where, why, and how. The question of who is quite easy. From whom did we receive money, or to whom did we pay money? Perhaps a gift came from the Smith family or a grant from the Johnson Foundation. If we're paying expenses, maybe we bought office supplies from Office Depot or paid rent to the landlord. What refers to the goods or services exchanged for money. Perhaps it was office supplies, printing services, or catering. For money coming in, perhaps it was a contribution for the annual fund, a registration for a workshop, or a gala table or golf foursome. When has to be the easiest of all. It's simply the date of transaction. However, we do want to be careful to capture the literal date. We might have one date for a pledge, but that pledge payment comes in a couple of months later. This is especially important at the end of a fiscal year or the end of a calendar year for tax receipts that we get the correct date of the transaction. Where? Now you think, that's strange. How does a transaction have a where? Well, it does. The transaction took place somewhere. Money came in and out. So our where might be the checking or savings account, accounts receivable or payable. But in one of our accounts in our accounting system, there is a where of where the transaction took place. That brings us to our why. Why did we spend money, or why did someone give us money? Perhaps it was for the job training program, a drug treatment program, an arts education program. But hopefully you recognize in those words that the why is our mission. Our programs, our projects on target to serve our communities. So our mission would be our why. Lastly, our how. How did this transaction take place? Again, for money coming in, did the donor write a check or use a credit card? Maybe you use third-party vendors like PayPal, Fundraise Up, Stripe, Blackbaud Merchant Services. Maybe they made a gift by giving you stock. And then for expenses going out, again, perhaps you wrote a check or you used a company credit card. So how did the transaction happen? To emphasize the importance of this concept of these data points, I want to mention what my students and clients refer to as the Mona method. There's nothing magical about the Mona method other than I use the software all the way. What on earth did she mean by that? Well, what I mean is what I put in the program description of this session. If you aren't receiving the information you need from QuickBooks Output, it's most likely because you aren't giving QuickBooks comprehensive input in the correct location and format for it to answer your questions. You aren't providing complete information of who, what, when, where, why, and how, or you are putting those data points in the wrong place, meaning mixing up your data points by putting a why in a what's location, or putting a who in a why's location. We have to keep these data points clean in order to keep the relations of our relational database applicable. If you start mixing apples and oranges, and by that I mean mixing your who's and what's and why's, you basically destroy the relationships, rendering your relational database useless. I get a huge amount of pushback when I get on my soapbox on this topic. People want to argue with me. Mona, your methodology is too cumbersome, too tedious. We don't have time for in-depth QuickBooks training and data entry. We don't have money for training or to hire someone to spend that much time on bookkeeping. Others in your office with a little QuickBooks experience will tell you that QuickBooks lady is crazy. You don't have to do all of that. There are lots of shortcuts that are much easier than that. But trust me on this. In 8 years of teaching QuickBooks, no one has ever come back to me and told me I'm crazy. But a whole lot of people have come back to me and said, now my reports make sense. We all know the saying about databases. Garbage in, garbage out. I want you to experience data in to get information out to make worthwhile, informed business decisions. So how do we ensure that we are putting the correct data in the correct place? There's the rub. The QuickBooks interface uses forms. If every transaction you enter is entered on the correct form, then QuickBooks does the heavy lifting for you. Is the transaction for money coming in or money going out? Is this a debit or a credit? Does this belong on my revenue and expense statement or my balance sheet? All of that is done automatically by QuickBooks if you put your who, what, when, where, why, and how in the correct field on the correct form. First, let me show you how not to do it. While there are exceptions, most of the QuickBooks users I meet fall into one of two categories. Category number one, a non-accounting person that has had little or no training in QuickBooks software. The most accounting they know is how to reconcile their personal checking account. This person is wandering around lost in the forest of QuickBooks until he or she comes across the banking menu. Pull it down and find Make Deposit. Great! I received contributions in the mail. I need to deposit them in the bank. They click Make Deposit and voila! A bank deposit slip appears and they fill it out. If you are currently creating deposits this way, I want you to never do that again. Why not? Because it doesn't allow tracking receivables, all of those event sponsorships and multi-year pledges we need to track. It's more difficult to search something. It doesn't allow for in-depth research and analysis because we skipped some of those data points. It's harder to find and correct mistakes. We've lost out on important QuickBooks functionality. It doesn't record the gifts on individual donor records in QuickBooks. It can even give you a false bank balance. What if you dated this deposit slip today, but because you're busy, you don't actually go to the bank for another week? What if the person doing payroll thinks the checking account has enough money for payday based on you entering a deposit slip, but you didn't really go to the bank? Continuing on, when our non-accountant needs to pay expenses, he or she goes back to the banking menu, finds the Write Checks function, and up comes the check form. It looks just like a check in your purse or wallet, doesn't it? Please stop doing this. Why? It doesn't allow for tracking payables. It's more difficult to search. Doesn't allow for in-depth research or analysis. It's harder to find and correct mistakes. And it doesn't record transactions on your vendor's records. Now, the second category of QuickBooks user I usually meet is the degreed accountant or CPA. You gotta love them, but they live in a very black and white world, don't they? For them, the world turns on debits and credits. If you are a non-accountant that ever took an accounting class, I bet the one thing you remember is debits on the left, credits on the right. Our CPA friends eat, sleep, and breathe debits and credits. They tend to find the QuickBooks journal entry form and use it for pretty much everything. You have to let me get up on my soapbox again. I mean, no offense to accountants and CPAs, but nonprofit people, you have got to stop assuming that just because someone has an accounting degree or is a CPA, that they somehow magically learned nonprofit accounting or Form 990s or received any training in QuickBooks software. Secondly, if they don't have nonprofit experience, their concerns and priorities may not match your concerns and priorities in deciding what data is important. They have more accounting knowledge than you could ever hope to. However, I have had many projects brought to me asking me to fix a QuickBooks file because the CPA didn't track functional expenses to complete the Form 990 easily, or allocate overhead expenses across programs, or identify expenses that are eligible for a restricted grant. For both the non-accounting person and the accountant CPA, they usually aren't using QuickBooks correctly simply to not being trained in the software. But now comes the next issue, going back to the Mona method. Forms are the key to everything in QuickBooks. There is the check form and the deposit form, which we've already seen. But there is also a sales receipt form, an invoice for pledges, a payment form when the pledge is paid, a form for bills, a form for credit card charges, a form for credit memos, a credit form, credit card refund form. Forms, 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 forms until you just scream, I can't take it anymore. I'm not doing this. I'm just going to use checks and deposits, or in the case of our CPAs, I can do the accounting with just journal entries. Debits on the left, credits on the right. That's all that's needed. And the end result? You print a lot of reports out of QuickBooks that don't tell you anything. So, if you ever wondered why your QuickBooks isn't working for you, reason number one, you're not feeding it complete information or in the correct location. Oh no, she just said reason number one, so there's more? Yeah, there's more. If the graphic interface of forms is the decor of QuickBooks, then reason number two why your QuickBooks isn't working for you is the architecture behind that decor. So let's talk about architecture, how your QuickBooks file is designed and built. In working with other databases, you may have heard terms like tables or modules. These are the houses that our different data points live in. QuickBooks calls them lists. Today we only have time to cover what I consider the most important. These are customers, vendors, the chart of accounts, items, and classes. People who pay us money are customers. We may call them members, donors, depending on what you do, may be clients or constituents. However, in QuickBooks mind, people who pay us money are customers. Back to our data points, customers represent our who's. Vendors are people we pay money to, whether it's for office supplies or printing, consultants we use, even the band for the gala. Vendors are also who's. The chart of accounts is how accounting really happens, isn't it? It's how we categorize the money we receive and the expenses we pay. This is where some people get a little confused between for-profit and nonprofit. Even though there is a nonprofit version of QuickBooks, it was created for our friends in the for-profit world with for-profit vocabulary. We tend to use the word revenue rather than income, which makes this a revenue and expense statement rather than a profit and loss statement. And people get really weird about us talking about profit, so we talk about surplus or deficit instead. Now notice something very important about our revenue and expenses. They are our whats. What did we pay money for? Payroll, postage, printing. What did our donors pay for? A membership, a program fee to attend a workshop? Our chart of accounts also includes those things on our balance sheet, including assets, liabilities. We don't have equity. We refer to it as fund balance. And what do we notice about our balance sheet accounts related to our data points? That's right, our wheres. This is starting to get fun, isn't it? Or am I the only nerd here? All right, so our chart of accounts gives us our revenue and expense report and balance sheet, also storing some what's and where's of our data points. Next up, items. Items might be new to you. Items are things we sell. You're thinking, we aren't Kroger. We don't sell things. Of course we do. Because items are individual goods or services we exchange for money. If you have a gift shop or a bookstore, then you aren't that different from Kroger after all. Hopefully, we'll return to selling gala tables, golf foursomes, fun run registrations. You sell memberships. Maybe you sell workshops, art classes, summer camp, and what I call intangibles. We would never say that we sold a grant to the Houston Endowment or ExxonMobil. However, for the QuickBooks structure, data points, and forms to work, I need an item for those things. My QuickBooks systems always include items called individual contribution and corporate or foundation grant so that I can put these items on my transaction forms. So while our more general revenue lines on the chart of accounts are what's, our items are also what's, but in greater detail for greater reporting. And finally, QuickBooks function of classes. On our IRS Form 990, you know you are required to divide expenses into the functional areas of programs, general management, and fundraising. Program service expenses are for the job training program, drug rehab program. Do you recognize these? They are our whys, our mission, the purpose we serve to better our community. So let me show you here where things really start to go wrong in your relational database of QuickBooks. Here are some typical expenses. I'm confident that everyone watching has these three expenses in your chart of accounts. But you know that you have to separate them for the functional expenses section of the tax return, as well as reporting to everyone else in the world about how much money you spend that is considered reasonable for overhead and fundraising. So you do this. Once you start down this path, you have to do this and this. And remember what I preach about keeping our data points clean? These things are the what's of our spending. These, however, represent whys. In one step, we completely destroyed our database. Our relational database no longer identifies the various relationships of our data points. These what's live in the expenses section of the chart of accounts, and you let whys move into the what house. Let's see how to keep them apart. Let's go back to the basic list of expenses from the chart of accounts which represent what's. If I asked you to do this in Excel, I have no doubt that you would put these what's in the first column and then create a separate column for each why. QuickBooks calls this function classes, and you can see that they are whys. Why did we buy the supplies? For the arts education program. Why did we print invitations? For the gala. Now I want to take a little more time to continue this train of thought. Back to the original list we know are what's. I've seen people worried about tracking expenses for a restricted grant, so they create a new expense line for it to separate it from other expenses. But the Johnson Foundation is not a what. It's a who. And where do who's live? In the customers and vendor lists. I've also seen people try to segment the expenses for a specific project or program. But a program is a why. And where do whys live? In classes. So we must build a foundation of customers, vendors, chart of accounts, items, and classes. And at the same time, we must manage the integrity of who, what, when, where, why, and how. If we do that, then every data point can talk to each other, resulting in proper data management and useful reports. So by understanding how QuickBooks thinks, we see what is necessary for QuickBooks success. Success begins at the very beginning. Build a strong architectural foundation for your QuickBooks database by using the various lists as building blocks. Don't take shortcuts of only using checks and deposits or journal entries. You will gather the information you need for the bottom line, but not in any format to provide you useful information through queries, filters, or reports. Provide all 6 data points of who, what, when, where, why, and how for every transaction in the correct field and on the correct form. Dedicate time and money to a thorough QuickBooks training program in order to learn how to take the concepts I've discussed today and put them into action. We trained so many of your colleagues over the last 8 years in the United Way of Greater Houston's Computer Lab. I certainly hope we will return to in-person training soon. In the meantime, know that this was my very first attempt at taking my QuickBooks philosophy into a pre-recorded online format. I plan to work with the United Way to bring more QuickBooks programs online, including finding ways to get back to a more hands-on training, including designing your QuickBooks database and transaction exercises. And finally, recognize QuickBooks as a database. This one point is so important to me that I have begun to pull away from the idea that I provide bookkeeping or accounting services to clients. No, I refer to myself as a QuickBooks database manager. I feel it implies more responsibility in the design, use, and maintenance of an information management system that is crucial to good business management, program success, and mission accomplishment. I hope you found this information useful. If I can answer any additional questions for you or you need assistance with your QuickBooks accounting system, please contact me at 281-687-6662, which is 281 our Mona, or by email at mona@fluentsolutions.com. Thank you for participating in Power Tools for Nonprofits.